what we're talking about here is still Big Bang Christianity, but then very quickly split off into multiple different sects. And even Socrates, you have the one Socrates, but immediately the next generation, you have this explosion of different versions of Socratic philosophy that become familiar divisions.
Diversity is a gift. It's not a challenge. It's not an embarrassment.
And yeah, in fact, we would wish for more, right? Not just the letters of Paul. We want like the letters of his opponents. That would have been really super handy. Making stuff up is the normal mode of operation, even within Orthodox Christianity.
We need to reward creativity and art and flexibility.
Doctors Richard Carrier and Dennis R. MacDonald, what are your opinions regarding the thesis advanced by Walter Bauer that originally there were many varieties of Christianity?
So you're asking about the theory of there are these various Christianities from the beginning, right?
Yeah,
rather than splitting off from a single original Christianity.
I'm not sure what Walter Bauer's thesis is.
Yeah, I haven't read his specific thesis on the origins of Christianity.
Do you have any clue?
Yeah, I worked quite a bit with that document, and I think it certainly is the case that he was right. But of course, Bauer was writing before Nag Hammadi, before the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I see.
And in fact, diversity is even greater than he knew. He also was committed to what we would call a history of religions model for the evolution of religions, largely geographically. And so he talks about how Egyptian Christianity is different from Syrian Christianity, although there are overlaps, how the Roman situation changed. And it really was a kind of Darwinian revolution, yeah, if I could talk about it that way, because he had an evolutionary model about how these traditions grew. Actually, the diversity is even greater than was the case with Walter Bauer. And this now can be demonstrated even with the diversity in Gnosticism. We have different strands of Gnosticism.
And this is mainstream now, so that's like I just take it for granted, right? So you're talking about a time when before Bauer suggested this, everybody thought there was this monolithic Christianity, and then he comes along and says, no, actually it's split off into a bunch of, like a ton of different sects. That's now just mainstream, like no one disputes that anymore. I mean, that's pretty much established.
When it gets disputed is to what extent these various strands are drawing on Judaism or Greco-Roman traditions, and it really has an evolutionary, geographically oriented model of development. Well, things are a lot messier than that, but he was able to see that the way we've usually understood Christian origins was monolithically evolutionary. And he broke the monolith so we recognize that we have these different patterns. So it was a very important intellectual shift.
Yeah, so I wasn't aware of that. I think that's different from the question of Big Bang Christianity versus multi-origin Christianity. What we're talking about here is still Big Bang Christianity, but then very quickly split off into multiple different sects. And
you can think of it as the Amway sales pyramid understanding of Christian
origins.
Interesting.
Yeah. And like I said, that's mainstream now. Like no one even disputes that.
Yeah.
So to get this straight, Bauer is not hypothesizing there were multiple out the gate origins, but immediately there's fractions from an original source. So like some people think there's an origin, I guess I've heard this said, it was never monolithic. There wasn't even a time where it was only one. Supposedly Christianity had multiple strands.
Yeah, there's different ways to do that. Like one model might be similar to what Dennis's model is, where you have a historical Jesus, he said some things and he gets killed, and then you have different followers go in different directions with that. You know, the Q community is doing its own thing, and then you have the Pauline community is doing another thing. And so you actually do have two original Christianities. The Big Bang is still there. It's Jesus in this case. It would be historical Jesus. But it's more like Socrates, and all of Socrates' disciples went off to create all the different various sectarian interpretations of Socratic philosophy. So you have, Plato is not the only one. You've got others. So even the Cynics split off from, the Antisthenes and Diogenes. That's all from Socrates. So you have even Socrates. You have the one Socrates, but immediately the next generation, or actually even during his life, but certainly right after he is dead, you have this explosion of different versions of Socratic philosophy that become familiar divisions in ancient philosophy, like the Cynics versus the Platonists, for instance, and then eventually the Stoics, right? So you have like all of this stuff splits off. So it would be a similar model in that respect.
Let me come at our earliest sources for Christian identity are the Pauline epistles. So, Derek, you're not exactly an expert in the field, but I'm going to ask my question to you. Did all Pauline Christians agree with each other? Or do we have polemics?
Yeah, there's definitely polemics. I mean, even Paul's audience, if you take
Paul
Galatians,
himself in Galatians mentions these people that you're supposed to declare anathema. Like that's how divided it
The
was
already
super
was.
apostles and
from what I even
James.
understand, some of the scholars like Steve Mason and people I've heard who take a deep dive looking at Paul say Paul didn't agree with Paul, and so like he changed his mind over time, and he wasn't thinking exactly what he was thinking out the gate versus how he was thinking about some of the things later on. So I don't know how true this is. I'm saying though, like when Paul can't even stick to the one same exact what he thought when he first wrote some of these things, that's a problem. Now, some scholars might go, that's evidence of later redaction or possible someone else, or it could just be Paul's a human and he had dealt with so much criticism. The way they look at it is Paul's writing his letters to certain groups, everything's cool, then all of a sudden everything's not so cool because now he's defending himself on every letter and it looks really like he's like, I'm not a liar, and now he has to change things he said early on maybe to try and get some of the criticism.
Derek, have you ever changed your mind about anything?
Never.
Yeah, and we all grow and we all change our minds, and we do so reacting to different environments and challenges. And this is clearly true in the Pauline epistles. Right. The reason that we have this homogenizing of Paul is driven not by history but by theology. Because if Paul can't get it all together, how can interpreters who are now modern theologians get it together? So there's a homogenizing impulse in the theological project that doesn't allow Paul to become a human being who changes his mind like I do almost every year.
That's because he was moved by the Holy Spirit and knew exactly what was said.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah, you forgot, guys. Come on. No, seriously, I appreciate this. It's interesting to know. I mean, obviously, we're trying to peek behind with very little evidence to really help support. I know that you guys are, wishing we had more data for a lot of this.
Oh yeah, it'd be great to have more and better data.
Exactly.
Less meddled with.
But with what you're working with, who knows? It'd be awesome to find out. We have to radically change some things, if we found it. But with what we're working with, it makes a lot of sense that Bauer's right about the fracturing of Christianity, but it's evident within the New Testament. So maybe it's Christianity and the scholars within Christianity that have kind of ignored this on purpose, but it seems self-evident. Historically, we see so many fractions of Christianity, Eastern and Western.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt. Yeah.
But out the gate,
But the issue then is that a liability or a benefit? In my view, it's a benefit. That is that early on, the images of Socrates divided between what you have in Plato, what you have in Xenophon, and what you have in Aristophanes. Now, that is a part of the richness of the Socratic tradition. Who would want to say that all of those witnesses to Socrates, witness to a coherent Socrates, diversity is a gift. It's not a challenge. It's not an embarrassment.
Yeah, in fact, we would wish for more, right? Not just the letters of Paul. We want like the letters of his opponents. That would have been really super handy. The letters of Apollos, or the letters of whoever these Jesus freaks he's talking about he wants to condemn as an anathema.
Yeah.
I want their letters. Like, what's going on there? What are they saying? You know, that would have been much more useful.
Okay, here's a pet peeve. And it's related to this topic, but you're going to see that it stretches the boundaries a little bit. There's a wide spread distribution of Christian apocryphal texts from the 2nd century into the 4th or 5th century that is a huge gift to Christian diversity. And we have the Gospel of Mary, we have the Gospel of Judas now, we have the apocryphal Acts of Andrew, Peter, John, Thomas, and so on. And some of these texts are themselves composite and represent different compositional moments. Now, one of my peeves is that there's such an interest in the diversity of these texts that we seldom pay attention to the Orthodox apocrypha. So that we're looking for Gnostic gospels, so we can talk about Gnosticism, or we want to talk about whatever, I suppose, variations of Syrian Christianity over against what's going on in Europe. But there's a Christian apocryphal tradition that values the New Testament and finds that it's inadequate, and they continue to rewrite these stories, and they do so because of new social situations or new theological developments and so on. So my peeve is that the Christian apocrypha gets overlooked because it's not as sufficiently politically correct, because we're looking for alternative voices.
Right, yeah.
And so we forget that the Orthodox are doing this creative, mimetic activity as well.
I think it's interesting what he's saying here too on fundamentalists who ignore that. Canon only. And it's like, the early Christians didn't believe that.
Yeah, and especially it's like what he's talking about just now is that gets used as an argument. Well, we can pick the Orthodox by the ones who didn't make stuff up. It's like, no, they were making stuff up. I would make this point in my book. If you were to make a catalog of all of the, like, set aside commentaries and certain things like that.
And sermons.
And sermons, right. But if you just look at epistles, gospels, and acts, and you're to make a catalog of everything we know existed, including the stuff we have fragments of, and stuff we know by name but we don't have any pieces of, it's about 10-to-1 ratio fiction, like made up stuff to canon, right? So this shows you that making stuff up is the normal mode of operation, even within Orthodox Christianity. So that's I think is a hard pill for some people to accept, but you should look at that. There's the same things are going on when you look at the so-called Gnostic stuff. What they're doing is the so-called Orthodox are doing the same stuff. They're doing the same kind of thing, but in defense of their own particular perspective.
Is it fair to say, rather than saying make up, even though that's what they're doing, to give it a prettier word, is it fair to say, no, they had imagination. And
Right.
They
Sure,
had
that would be,
great
yeah, that's a positive spin.
And the sad part about fundamentalists, look at the Puritans, right? Who the hell wants to live like what we see the Puritans? No music. Women are being burned at the stake because you think they might be a little bit into that magic stuff. God forbid, look at Deuteronomy. Put them to death if they do. Really, really strict, dry, it seems like no fun. That's not early Christianity. They are way more fun than that. And if you look at Papias, right? Suppose we grant, let's look at Papias for a second. The way that he has mythologized Judas, anyone who reads that, even though it's gross, it's funny. It's like creative. It's like, dude, he's got worms crawling out of his penis. Like who isn't going, ew? And we know what he means. He's trying to say it's so ugly. But do you think Papias really believed? I'm not going to say he couldn't have. He might have been a fundamentalist in a different way. But I wonder if this is like, I want people to know to never be like that with the Lord. Never betray the Lord, right? Let's paint a picture why you always want to be faithful or something. That might be what he meant, even though he was very sensational.
Yeah, we don't actually have Papias. This is important. We only have quotations.
Right.
And so he had this a 5-chapter book that he'd written, apparently. So can't really answer that question if we didn't have the whole book, because we don't have his preface. We don't have, we can't really assess what his methodology was. Now, Eusebius gives us a peek into his methodology. Now, that's somewhat of Eusebius's selection of it. So you're kind of you're seeing through the eyes of the bias of Eusebius. But the selection that Eusebius gives us suggests that what Papias was doing was just going around asking people to tell him stories and then writing the stories down.
Yeah.
And he outright says, supposedly, that he wasn't even interested in written text. So he wasn't looking at letters. He wasn't looking at documentary evidence. He wasn't doing any textual analysis or comparison at all. He was just going around talking to people
Okay,
who
I'm
claimed
going
to
to
know
have
someone.
I'm going to have to jump in. That is not right.
Oh, really? Okay.
Okay, he trusts oral voices as transmitters of lore that come from the apostles that he considers
Right.
can be congenial. But he certainly is interested. He says it in his preface. We do have the preface.
Oh, right,
We don't
we have
have
that.
a coherent version
Correct.
of the preface.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
do
We have
preface.
Eusebius's
And he tells
pieces
us what
of
he's
it.
trying to do. He's trying to restore the order of Matthew's original book by comparing Mark and two Greek Matthews that he knows. The one we have and one we don't, and I think the one we don't is the Q document.
Right.
But he certainly, and then he says, I want to write commentary on that, but I want to augment it with this
Right.
other
Yeah.
material.
Yeah, yeah.
So
But
it's
the
very
other material,
similar.
he says he doesn't trust the written word, so he only trusts the oral word. So it's the way he's building out off of this is collecting oral lore within his community. So when you get to the Judas thing, I can't say whether Papias is making that up or whether that's just something someone told him. It's part of the lore that was passing around.
Twice he uses the expression "fassi," that is, they say.
Yeah,
And
right.
so it probably is an appeal to. Now, when he
Well,
talks
Eusebius
about
uses
oral
that
tradition,
a lot. A lot of Eusebius's stuff is a they say. There's
yeah,
a
but
lot
this
of
is a
stuff.
citation.
So,
Yeah,
so I think Papias probably is doing the same kind of thing. That when Eusebius talks about they say, I think Papias is doing the same thing.
I want to spin out on this issue of Papias a little bit, not to challenge what Richard's reading of it is, but rather to say that fundamentalist Christians have two categories for interpreting early Christian text, and many conservatives are aware of Christian apocryphal text. They've been in New York Times for, but the categories they have are canonical and non-canonical. And canonical is inspired and non-canonical is heretical. That is not the taxonomy that early Christians
Correct,
themselves used for understanding these texts. They understood their Bible to be the primary carrier of tradition and authority. There's no doubt about that. But there are, in some cases, two more categories or three more categories. And the next category is material that is not canonical, but is devotionally useful. And a lot
Suitable
of
for instruction. Yeah.
and a lot of that is still mythological. It would not come close to what we're considering to be responsible. A good example is the Acts of John by Prochorus, that even today on Mount Athos is read by monks in monasteries as though it were scripture. And they have Bible studies that are around the Acts of John by Prochorus, and its vision of what's going on for the history of John the Apostle is absolutely outrageous, and nothing
That's the bed bugs one, right? The one
no,
with
that's
with
the other Acts of
the
John.
other Acts of John,
But
okay.
but it's just absolutely preposterous. But it's devotional. It evokes conversation. So the monks will read a little bit, and then they'll pray about it, and then they'll talk about it some more, and they'll read another text. The same way that Baptists read the Psalter, let's say. So, but then there is another that has to do with heretical texts. But there is this middle ground, and Eusebius actually has four different stages: the canonical, and the devotionally useful, and the adiaphora that doesn't matter much. But then there is this fence beyond which no one ought to go. And so then you have beginning in the 4th century, lists of heretical books.
Right.
And you have anticipations of that with the heresiologists already in the end
right.
of the 2nd century.
late 2nd, early 3rd century.
So,
we already got this going.
The modern fascination that we have a Bible that's inspired and nonsense that's everything else does not reflect how these texts were composed or read.
You know, two things I just want to end on this is saying, this is wonderful. Poor Betty Sue, whoever she is, I just say this as a fictional point to make. She was reading the wrong damn text, and these fundamentalists, you know, I don't know how they would answer this, but Betty Sue probably lost her salvation reading that book. I wonder what kind of books there were that we don't have right now that they were cherishing as scripture that are totally heretical in the fundamentalist modern Protestant mindset. And last of all, the texts that would be and are spoken of within our New Testament canon that we know we don't have, where's God at preserving his word? And why don't we have it? Oh, well, there's always an excuse. Well, we have all that we need. God knew what we needed. Get out of here. We know we don't have some of Paul's letters. We know we don't have some of these scriptures. So I'm just jabbing at the fundamentalists who don't see the imagination and the wonder of the early Christian movement. Sure, they were superstitious. None of us are discrediting that they were superstitious in these things, but there was a much bigger imagination, and they weren't as fundamentalist about this stuff. Maybe by the 4th century, things start to get politically and religiously, like, we need to take this in this direction to have control and all this stuff.
Well, you start to see that trend with some authors who just happen, of course, later to be assigned Orthodox,
Right.
which is why we have them.
Irenaeus.
Once you get to like about Tertullian, right? When Tertullian, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, you get to those, you start to see the trend of, no, we need to like control doctrine. We need to like decide who's in and who's out.
Right.
And it's fuzzy at that point. When you get, Nicene Creed, that's when you get the Nicene Council, that's when you're starting to really draw hard lines. And then of course the 4th century becomes the boom industry of like deciding who's in and who's out, what text do we keep and which text do we not. So you see the trend, but I think it's a trend in one trend line of Christianity. I think there's a lot of other Christianity going on. Maybe they're doing it too, but they're doing it in a different, they're making different selections, and some of them might not have been doing it at all. They might have been fine with like having an open collection of literature. But we do have this distortion that you have like the 4th century is kind of deciding which 3rd and 2nd century authors we get to read. And so it creates the impression that is, they were the leaders, the leading lights of Christianity altogether. No, it's just one strand of Christianity, right? Is all we're getting the view of. But you can see the growth of this interest in becoming more hardline, more fundamentalist. Fundamentalist is the wrong word because that's actually a really modern term.
Yeah.
I'd say like more literalist, more strict, I think is what you're trying to use that word to designate. But yes, you see that trend, but we do have to remember that there's all this other Christianity going on that we have only fragments of little pieces that we can look through to see. We don't get to see we don't get to see Tertullian's opponent writing his treatise at the same time, right? Like, that kind of thing. So,
Thank you.
This sounds like it's a theological observation, but it isn't. I think it's a philosophical observation. Why is it that religious people often are suspicious of art and imagination? And they want the gospel authors to be historical recorders of antecedent tradition, when in fact they're artists and they're aware of narrative and philosophical possibilities in their world, and they're using art and creativity in order to address their communities and to give them meaning in this crazy world. And that happens in Gnostic texts, it happens in Jewish texts, it happens in we need to reward creativity and art and flexibility. And why that gets diminished, as though everybody has to be accurately recording things that come from Jesus, is, I'm sorry, that's not the way art works.
yeah, truly. But psychologically, we can explain this because it is a trend that always happens, right? What you have is people are arguing with each other. And if you accept that, which we should, right, that's actually the humanist correct way to look at literature and all production, intellectual and otherwise. If you look at it that way, then everything is man-made, everything is human. right? So, and humans are fallible and sinful and whatever. So you can't trust it. You can't trust it if it comes. It has to come from God. But the only way you can be sure it comes from God is if it's literally true, right? So there's this trend. There actually is this trend, sort of rhetorical need to like build fences and build your little castle and hide inside it. Is you kind of have to depend on the literalism of the text in an attempt to prevent it from changing. And
That's right. It comes from insecurity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that is where it comes from. And there's a psychological literature on, the authoritarian personality and how these kinds of things like operate in all domains, not just in religion, operating from the need for certainty and the being uncomfortable with ambiguity, being uncomfortable with probability is wishy-washy, right? Or diversity, right? Yeah. There is you can see like psychological patterns that are universal that kind of explain why this sort of thing happens, why it tends to go that way. And as the literalists, fundamentalists today would say, it's like those liberal Christians have no text, right? Because the text can mean whatever they want it to mean, right? They go in there and they human interpretation of the text. And so the fundamentalists claim that they're getting the correct, they have there's only one single correct interpretation, and if it's literal, that limits the number of things you can say that the text means. Now, in practice, they're doing the same stuff. They're reading out of it whatever they want to read out of it, but in their mind, what they're going for is the narrow one possible meaning, which is the literal meaning, and that's more comfortable. That's why they put themselves in that mindset. That's more comfortable. Whereas the liberal Christians, well, they're in a bit of a sea, right? Like they have to navigate an ocean of possibilities and deal with doubt and uncertainty and
why the
different
Catholic
points
Church,
of view. And
the Catholic Church is wanting to be the arbiter, if you will, of truth and saying, let us do the interpreting for you because we have the infallible Pope. We have...
Yeah, in the Middle Ages, especially, right? Because that was when that was part of the Protestant Revolution. We're going to democratize the reading of the text. Now that isn't what they ended up doing in practice, but it's what they were selling as the original idea. Is that the Church shouldn't be keeping the Bible from the public. The public should have access to the Bible. Was one of the messages of Protestant movements. Of course, then they ended up starting, gradually doing the same thing that the Vatican did, basically trying to enforce particular interpretations of the Bible.
Okay, I know we're almost out of time. I would like to flag for us another conversation about something like relative and competing interpretations of the same text. And because some of the distortions of the reading of the Gospels, for example, are as egregious among liberal Christians and atheists as they are among fundamentalists. In other words, fundamentalists are not the only ones who distort texts. Yeah. And that can happen from any ideological position,
absolutely.
Even one that affirms diversity of these texts. And I think there is a way around simply a kind of nihilistic fatalism. We all read the text differently, so we have nothing to go on, and so the text has a rubber nose, and so let's not be historians. I just don't think that is very helpful as a historian.
Yeah.
But what criteria can we have, and what philosophical orientation can we bring to these texts that allows us to have diverse readings without having relativistic, endless readings, many of which are impossible?
Yeah.
And how do we let the text itself police the interpretations that are legitimate? I don't believe in one interpretation of a text, but I don't believe in a million interpretations of a text.
Right, yeah.
So what criteria can one use to be more scientific in the understanding of a text?
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.